Okay, so I'm super excited to have a chance to spend some time with everyone and feel like there's a big responsibility here. The next three modules are basically on this topic of how do we think about turning science into valuable products, which is the whole of it. And there's so much there. And so the point of this session is really to introduce us to some of the big picture framings that we've developed here at Activate, and get us in the mindset of how to think about both mapping out that journey, but also going and jumping into it. I'm gonna switch over to slides here. I think I've got 12 or so slides, and what I'll try and do is jump through those, provide some frameworks. Hopefully Stephen will jump on, and we'll have some chance for Q&A and discussion at the end. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And great. And maybe just give me a thumbs up if and when you can see the slides pop up. Great. So I want to jump in here with a quote that I came across a few years back and has always stuck with me. And it's a definition of innovation. It's attributed to someone at Intel. I tried to track that person down and they said, I don't know if I ever said that. So I have it without attribution here. But the quote is people creating value through the implementation of new ideas. And I love this definition because a lot of people, depending on your frame, you might think about innovation as basically ideas, right? In the academic world, we center, this whole sentence centers around the ideas. But as you work through, well, how do I turn my research, my science into something valuable? You need to have these other components, right? So the first one, even though it's not highlighted here that I mentioned, is like people, right? This is to Activate our whole philosophy. It's about people. You need people to drive these things forward. So you need the people, the team. Really, this is about creating value. And the basic concept is if you're not creating value for someone, you don't have a product, you're still living in the world of ideas. And so understanding what that value is, and then you need this implementation piece of it. So all these pieces come together. And what I'd like to focus on today is this question of, well, what does it mean to create value? And how do we think about a mindset or a framework or process to do that? And what I'm hoping to do here is introduce a handful of framings for concepts that you've probably already heard and thought about, but hopefully that shift your perspective in terms of how to relate to those ideas and how to make them practical and actionable. And so we're gonna start with thermodynamics, then we're gonna talk a little bit about kinetics, and then we'll do some takeaways. I'm sort of notorious for thinking in terms of analogies and metaphors, and often they're broken and they're not really consistent. So what I'm about to do is introduce a metaphor or an analogy, and I'm just gonna say up front, like this is a directional analogy. If you try and go 3 levels deep, it's gonna break down. So just try and sit with me at a very high level, right? We're gonna sit at the 0th order here. But here's, this is a frame that's always stuck in my head. And as scientists and engineers, the question is, well, how should you think about creating value in a business? And this has always been helpful for me. And the basic idea is, let's go back to freshman chemistry or even high school chemistry and think about some reaction dynamics. You want a reaction to happen. It's not going to happen if you don't have sound thermodynamics. You need to be, right? You need to have more energy you need to have the right conversion of energy, and there's going to be some activation energy which might prevent that reaction from happening. And when you think about all the entrepreneurship you've sort of heard about and learned, I see delta G as the value proposition, and I see the activation energy is related to the business model. And fundamentally, the question you need to ask yourself is, do I have a viable reaction? Meaning, do I have a viable business? I mean, I like the idea that it's delta G because you can think about it as like delta green, you got to make someone money. And frankly, if you think about your product, you have some set of materials, you have some set of components, your idea, your IP, whatever, and then you're going to sell a product. And if that product is not more valuable than the sum of those components, you're toast, right? So it needs to be an exothermic reaction for this to work. That's about the product, the value you're delivering. And that's necessary, but that's not sufficient. Because as we know, we can wait our whole lifetimes for carbon to turn into diamond and it won't happen. And so the way I frame this mentally is the thermodynamics, the delta G is really about the value proposition. And then there's the question of the business model, meaning, okay, I have a product that I can sell to someone and they really want it and it's really valuable. Now the question becomes, can I actually build a business that is able to take the raw components, make and deliver that product to those people and actually extract that value? Because if I can't, it doesn't matter. I'm toast again. So let me just pause there for a second. And what I'd like you to do is think about examples that you might know of innovation projects or companies that failed either because they were delta G limited or because they were activation energy limited, right? Either because they were value proposition limited or business model limited. And just see if that framing kind of works and you can think in those terms. And what I'll do is in 5 seconds here, I'm gonna flip to the next slide and talk about a few case studies that come to mind. Do me a favor, just give me a thumbs up if like, we're okay, we're flying the plane at the right level right now. Okay, great. I'm gonna keep it moving. So here are a few case studies, some that you may have heard of, some that you haven't. The first two here are just examples of stories that I would characterize, and again, this is my own characterization, as really exciting efforts that were either kind of thermodynamically or kinetically limited. So if we think about everyone knows the Segway, right? So if you think about the Segway, when the Segway came out, there was this idea of like, wow, this is a wild, radical innovation. I mean, you know, the idea this thing could self-balance was incredible. And fundamentally, like Segway did not take off as an enormous company. And my take is like, frankly, people just didn't need it as much as you might have thought, right? Of course, there were some niches of people, you know, the campus police that found it really, really exciting and valuable. And so it's not that they died altogether. We can think of other examples where just nobody wanted the product and it died altogether. You know, Segway didn't die, but there wasn't enough of a driving force to propel this to be an incredible, you know, really big world-changing business. And so one of the reasons I bring up this case study is you can talk about the thermodynamics and, you know, there's always going to be a distribution, right? There's always going to be some niche products that have a lot of driving force. And so that really comes down to the question, this relates to sort of business model in the sense that I'm going to get really geeky here, right? Like there's delta G per mole and then there's absolute value delta G, right? So on a per mole basis, you might have some on a per customer basis, you might have some people that really want this product, and that could be okay. And you can create a business like Segway, which was a business that got created, and in many ways you could talk about it as an success. If you think about a venture capitalist, they would say, well, having some customers that really want this isn't enough. The absolute value of how exothermic this reaction is needs to be really big for me. So like, I need a big market size, right? And in this case, you didn't have the combination of those. You had maybe one, not the other. Hopefully that's part of this is making sense. Let me tell you the story. People might not know about this company, Pax Scientific. And I'll say like my knowledge of Pax is a little bit dated. And so they, you know, I'm going to give my characterization and I'm going to apologize if pieces of this have changed or aren't quite right. But Pax was founded by a guy named Jay Harmon out of Australia. Jay grew up, as far as I understand, as sort of like a naturalist, hippie, scuba diving out in nature. He recognized at some point that he kept seeing these really interesting shapes in nature, in the ocean and otherwise. And he did a couple experiments early on where he flushed a toilet and he actually captured a mold of the shape of the vortex of the toilet. And then he created out of that mold a fan similar to the one you see here. And not based on theory, purely experiment, he ran tests on the efficiency of that fan in blowing air. And it turned out he could push 30 to 40% more fluid with a fan of this shape than a conventional top of the line off the shelf industrial blower. And that's radical. I mean, that's incredible. And he went around, and the first challenge he had was nobody believed him. And then he showed people the results, and they said, whoa, like this is incredible. Like you think of all industrial HVAC, we could replace all of the blowers in there and get 30 or 40% more efficiency or performance. And he started to build the case for what would be a really exciting business around that. And after a few steps into it, what he realized was for most of the applications he cared about, the people who would benefit from that value were not the people who could be his customers or who own the channels into that market. And what I mean by that is generally the people who pick out and buy the blowers that go into new buildings are the builders. Generally, the people who benefit from the efficiency or the performance are the lease tenants or the people who reside in those buildings. And guess what? The builders don't make decisions based on performance because they don't really care. They're still going to be able to sell the building, sell the house. What they make decisions on is, if I put this into my new building, is there any chance this is going to go wrong? Because I'm going to sell this building to be around for 30 years. And so for them, the activation barrier, the idea that they would put a funky fan in that looked different was a non-starter. And unless and until Jay could come back with not 1, not 5, but 20 years of data that this thing wasn't going to fail, right? That sort of thing, there was just no reason for them to do it. So there's this big potential delta G to an end user, but then there's this activation energy in the sense of how do I get it to that user? So that's one kind of nuanced example of what could be really great value created that you just can't find a way to realize. There are other ways that the business model or activation energy can get in the way. One of the ones that comes to mind the most is you've got a product that people really want. So let's say I could build for you, I have an innovation that could build for you a battery that is 5 times more energy dense than the one that you have. Pretty exciting. But it turns out that the cost of building a plant to manufacture those batteries is $1 trillion. And I can't figure out how to get the $1 trillion. And so there may have been an opportunity there to create the value, but there's no way for me to actually execute on that business model. That's another way you can have that failure. I don't want to take too much time here, but what I would like to say is this can be hard to predict. And sometimes it's not clear. And so without spending too much time, if you don't know the story of General Magic, there's a great documentary out there. General Magic was basically trying to build an iPhone 20 years ago, maybe. And the reason I bring it up is General Magic was like the hottest company in Silicon Valley. They had tons of funding. They had tons of energy. And they released the first product and it kind of failed because nobody really needed it or wanted it. Or you could argue, well, that first product just wasn't compelling enough. It was too clunky because it was ahead of its time. So you could say, well, it didn't fail because it wasn't valuable. If you could have sunk another $10 billion into that company, they could have created the next generation of that product and it would have been helpful, right? So did it die because it wasn't valuable or because of the business model? Who knows? If you think of the early days of Tesla, it's kind of the same thing, right? You had this idea of a roadster. You had this idea of like the future is going to change. And there were many moments, and if you talk to people who were at Tesla in the early days working with Elon, there were moments where it was like, we don't know whether this company is alive or dead because we don't know whether we've done enough to prove that there's enough value here and that the business model is viable. And so one of the things I want to point out here is that these things are dynamically changing, right? The question of is something viable is dynamically changing based on what's happening in the market or what's happening even in what you've proven, right? It has to do with perception, right? Can you get the next investment? Has to do with have you created value? It also has to do with do people believe you are going to create value or not? So I say that because we're about to move into some things that I think take this to a different set of complexity, but hopefully these case studies help to just cement some of this mental framework. I'm realizing there's going to be a lot here. So, if you got questions or thoughts on this, we don't have to address them all in this session. We'll have time over the next, a couple of years to go through some of this. So let me just share a couple perspectives on the question of evaluating value proposition, which is critical, and I think is the first thing you need to do. And these slides should be reasonably self-explanatory, but how do you figure out if it's sufficiently exothermic? Well, in consumer software, it turns out it's kind of easy. Like, go build a prototype, release a beta, put it in the hands of customers, see if they love it. And if they love it, you don't really have to worry about it because it's probably exothermic because it's going to be so cheap to make and distribute because it's a piece of software. Right. And so this is why you see software companies where they can start a company and just say, let's get users, freemium model. Let's just get lots of users for free. Then we'll figure out how to make money. Obviously in hard tech and obviously in industrial spaces, like, you can't play that game for so many reasons. So a few of the tips, and you're going to hear more about this from Beth and from Amy over the next couple of sections, but a few of the tips that we've seen is, one is, you can't do those rapid iterations. They're really expensive in hard tech. Industrial users are not going to engage with things in the same way. So, instead of doing a beta, what we've seen be effective is create a spec sheet. So let me just ask here, raise your hand if you have a spec sheet with some sort of product rendering on it, whether or not you're close to a product. Okay, I've got about, I think, a third. And so one of the mental exercises to go through is, well, what if you went ahead and just built that spec sheet with that rendering right now and started using that as a way to engage customers and see, not just are they interested, but what we found is the standard's pretty high with industrials because they, they're happy to tell you things are interesting without actually caring. And so the real proof is, will they actually part with some money to see you develop towards making that spec sheet a reality? If you can get to a point where you've got people who are saying, wow, if this existed, it would be a really big deal from customers, that's necessary but not sufficient. Because now you have to ask yourself, well, okay, can I actually deliver something with these qualities, with these specs, with the raw components that I have? And as you know, that can be really, really complicated if you haven't yet designed your product, right? To now think about all the different design trade-offs. And that's where you need to start building a model. And you need to start getting quantitative about it. And I would argue that until you are able to convince yourself both that there are folks who want to pay money really badly, ideally, to see this product exist, and that you have a model that reasonably to first order suggests that with some assumptions you could go build it. Frankly, I believe spending a lot of time on other aspects of the business model is probably not worth it. With the exception of the fact that you might need to spend other aspects of those to get funding to spend more time doing this sort of value and customer discovery. So, but the key here is, if you wanted to go run a reaction, would you go and set up the reaction and set up the experiment if you didn't yet know whether it was exothermic, right? Like, if the reaction would go. So that's kind of the idea here. So if you think about it, yeah, okay, so now I've decided I've got something really valuable, I've got good thermodynamics. Then the question is, are the kinetics a deal killer? And I'll just stop here and say, this is where it gets really, 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 really challenging and complicated and confusing. And where I can't give any simple tips on how to do this. I'll give some nuanced tips. But if you think about that, our framing at Activate, and the thing that you'll see over and over, is our view as well. The business model, the potential barriers, the potential risks to delivering that value are going to come across these four buckets. The technology, right? Like, how many miracles do you have? What about reliability? If you're going to need to test this and show data for 20 years before you sell it, you're probably toast from a business model perspective. How about the market? Is it big enough, et cetera? What about the finance? I mentioned that, what if it's $1 trillion plant? your toast there as well, and then the team. And the part about this that the more you do this, you will start to understand is you will have isolated questions and assumptions and unknowns and risks in each of these areas, and those will be important. And then you will have ones that are coupled, right? So how much is it going to cost? Will I be able to raise the money to build a first plant? Well, I don't know. It depends. How big is the market? And is it compelling to VCs? And do you have a team that can instill confidence, right? So ultimately, what you're looking for in a business model is you need all of these questions and components to align and sing together where it's kind of self-consistent, self-cohesive. And that probably doesn't make a lot of sense in abstract. So I'll just throw it out there. And we'll try and dig into it a little bit more. I mentioned I'm notorious on metaphors and analogies. I'm also notorious on being really bad with time management, especially in these sorts of settings when I'm trying to talk. So let me flash a handful let me flash some of the part two, which is I think in some ways a little bit simpler. And I don't think we need to spend that much time. And then, Brent, I can't see everyone's faces. Did Steve have a chance to pop on?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so, hey, Steve.
Hey.
All right, well, I've got your mic unmuted. Maybe I could just take a chance now to give you a chance to quickly introduce yourself. And I don't know how much of this if you've heard, but you saw the slides. Yeah. Any sort of upfront framings based on or reactions to some of this based on your experience, and then we'll jump into the next part.
Sure, yeah. So my name's Stephen Kay. I was, I guess the first Cyclotron Road Fellow, and the co-founder of Mosaic Materials. Right now I am at Apple, where well, my roles are getting a little weird these days, but my primary role is as the head of battery materials for something called Special Projects Group, basically responsible for new battery chemistries and technologies for products that Apple doesn't make and sell today, but wants to get into. I also have another part of my group that works on health diagnostic technologies. And that's about all I can say on that part, but that's a new effort and getting kind of interesting these days. In terms of, I guess, comments on what you said, I think probably the most interesting for me in terms of things that were really important when I was at a startup, and equally so now on the other side of things, is how you get how you really gauge interest from industry partners. And I think the point you made about, are they willing to get involved financially is really key. It's, I have companies pitching me technologies all the time. I'm interested in anything that might work, just from an interest standpoint, but whether it's, the real key is this compelling enough that I'm willing to put time, and I can get other people at the company to put time and money into it. The trick of it is that you have to have a reason for the company to engage. It's very easy for us to, sit back and say, okay, yeah, that looks really exciting. As soon as you've got something ready for us to test, great. Let us know, happy to try it. But for us to get involved, to put in our time, to put in our resources, we have to see not only that it's exciting, but that there's some reason that us putting time into it will get us some kind of advantage. Whether it's an early look, whether it's an ability to customize it for a project we're working on or a product we're working on, there needs to be some aspect where, where there's value there for the company, not just where, we think it's cool and so we'll hand you money for it. We don't, most companies won't act like grant agencies in that regard. And so figuring out in your industry, what is the value you can give to a company that will, cause them to sort of prove their level of interest is a trick you got to play.
Steve, let me just ask you, so Stephen left, basically quit his job and jumped into fellowship to work on an idea that he had, having observed kind of the trajectory of his field since his PhD, and that turned into Mosaic Materials. If you rewind, Steve, to the early days of Mosaic Materials, which was, okay, we've got MOFs that can do all these phenomenal things, and we think that they can be valuable in industry. You know, when you were sitting there and thinking about, okay, how do I prove to myself and others that there's enough value we can create here and that there might be a business model? I'm just kind of curious for you to go back into that mindset, and if you have any thoughts and reflections on, like, what did it feel like to try and think about that daunting task?
Yeah. So, what had been interesting for the time, so at the time I was doing that, I had been involved in MOFs first in my PhD, and then sort of tangentially while I was at Wildcat for, I don't know, I guess it was about 10 years at that point, maybe a little more. And what I had seen is steadily over time, various academic groups had demonstrated more and more sort of lab scale evidence that these materials could work much better than the conventional porous materials out there for gas separations, but it was all lab scale. And, with all of the sort of, assume pi equals 3 kind of assumptions that goes into that. And what I had seen when I was at my first company was that to really demonstrate value, you had to get industry partners to put your materials into actual prototype devices under real world conditions. And that for the most part, they just couldn't do that until they had meaningful quantities, not gram scale, but in batteries, it's kilograms. Turns out in gas separations, it's kilograms to tens of kilograms. And so, essentially, what I knew was, okay, if we had a set of applications that looked promising, we were never going to be able to really prove that until we could get kilograms of material in people's hands in a form they could use. And so at the beginning of Mosaic, like, that was the main thing that we focused on, was how do we, was making these things scalable process and then putting them into effectively pellets. So you can't work with powders, you need little beads. Otherwise the powder gunks up all the valves and you get gas flow problems, things like that. And so that was what I focused on in the beginning. And then Tom, really picked that up and got to that point. And once he did, then he was able to get customers interested in actually using the materials.
Yeah, I actually, that's a perfect segue in my mind, because, where you talked about sort of the process, and then you kind of emphasize, so this is what we focused on. And I just want to pause and reflect on that, because fundamentally, the question as you're walking around surrounded by all these data streams around, like, how do I create value with what I'm doing, and how do I think about business model? There's really just one question, which is like, what do I focus on next to move this thing forward? And so let me go back and share screen. And
yeah, while you're doing it, I think the key thing that we were focused on, and sort of dovetailing with your point, is you've got to demonstrate that customer interest. Otherwise, you never know whether you're working on the right thing, and you won't ever be, and even if you were confident, you'll never be able to prove it to somebody else. So figure out, like, what does your customer need in order to get excited and actually start putting up money and working with your stuff. And that's got to be the key focus. And to your other point, you can't have too many miracles in between where you're at and where you need to get to. Otherwise, you'll be spinning your wheels forever.
Right. So it sounds like for you, it was going out, understanding those customers, understanding where that delta G, where that value could be, and then them saying, yeah, but we can't actually validate that there's anything valuable here until you deliver kilograms of material, with these specs. And then you said, okay, let's go focus on that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I basically went out and talked to, I don't know, dozens of different companies in the space to, figure out that was what we needed to do before I even started the company, because I wouldn't have started it unless I knew that there was that path.
Great. So let me try and breeze through this second part. And I have it labeled kind of cutely, again, the analogy breaks down as managing kinetics, but the idea is, okay, well, how do you then start to move things forward and decide to drive these reactions the right way, or, yeah. So this is like what came to me, which is, if you're a founder, you're an entrepreneur, like this is your objective. If you think of that definition of innovation, people creating value, like there's one verb there, right? The verb is creating value. So this is your objective. But if we want to be a little bit more nuanced, it's not enough to just say, let's create value. This is a framework that you'll probably see in a number of places when people talk about entrepreneurship. But really what you're trying to do is create a value inflection point. And I'm now going to introduce the idea that we can think of value as the inverse of risk, or risk is the inverse of value. Oftentimes you will hear, and I'll implement it for the rest of this talk, you will hear people talk about managing innovation through managing risk and eliminating risk or decreasing risk. Vinod Khosla, who funded my company, really loves that framework and has a lot of good stuff out there on it. So I'm probably going to start using the word risk, but you can think about these interchangeably in certain ways. But the idea I want to point out here is the idea of an inflection point, right? As an entrepreneur, as a founder, you've got limited time and resources. And so what you care about is not the marginal incremental value you create or risk you reduce. What you're looking for are those opportunities to drop it significantly. And so if we just think about what Steve was saying, okay, he first had a risk around, does anyone actually want this? Is this exothermic? Is there something to build? And as he had those conversations, something emerged, which was, okay, this is interesting, but it gets a lot more interesting if you can give me kilograms of materials. So now he has this sense of, okay, if I can get to kilograms of materials, I can get a step change in the value and the risk. There's another chance to remind people that, value is only through perception, right? So is also through perception. And so we're defining value as what do the customers think is value. You might define it as what the investors think is value is a different place. And so what you're looking for at any given moment is where are those step changes and how do I go after them? And there's even more, right? Which is you don't want to just create a value risk inflection. You're always looking to create the most meaningful, productive value risk inflection, given the finite time and resources you have. And that's the best you can do at any given moment, right? There's just nothing more. There's nothing more you can do. You can beat yourself up all day as a founder. If you run out of time and money, the best thing you can do is try and capture that next piece of value and inflection. One of the reasons the Activate fellowship program exists is by giving you more time. Hopefully you can either set your sights onto a more interesting value inflection point or have a better probability of getting to one that's meaningful on any of these fronts. So then the question becomes, okay, but where do I start in understanding how to prioritize this? I won't spend too much time here, but if you look at these bullet points on the left, hopefully they'll make sense. It's impossible to fully assess all the risks that you're going to face. There are these really annoying things called unknown unknowns, which will always be out there at risk and you won't know about. So you just need to acknowledge that first of all, but you can identify and systematize the known risks that you have, and ideally the most critical ones. And you can systematically go after retiring those risks and creating value in those areas. And again, you always need to normalize this by the time and effort that's needed to get you to that critical path. And on the right here, you've got just a general risk matrix framework, which is, well, let's look at each of these risks and look at the probability of, is this going to be the thing that kills my effort? And then let's look at the severity of, well, if this happens, or if I can't accomplish X, how bad is it? And you can use that as a way to start to prioritize this. I'm going to give a very simple example, and this is care of our former colleague, Dane Boyson, who is one of the folks I know who is most strongly wired towards thinking really systematically in nuanced ways about risks, specifically of technology development, but otherwise. I'm going to give you what I say is a simple example because it's an example from technology development. So it'll be close to your heart and it'll, it's pretty straightforward, which is, Dane worked on developing liquid metal batteries, so this was his example. We can just think of what are your objectives? What are the things that will make this valuable? In this case, across these different parameters for the device. And that's the requirement. This is what I need to get to for something to be valuable. And then you can look at, well, what's the biggest technical risk that's stopping us from getting there? I'm not going to spend a lot of time. This is pretty straightforward. Then you can take those risks and you can say, all right, well, what's the probability that that's going to be an issue? And if it is an issue, what's the severity? How much toast are there? One way to think about the severity also is to look at like what alternate paths are there. If there's a single point of failure and there's no alternate path, then you're really kind of toast from a severity standpoint. Then you can quantify this if you're so inclined, and then you can prioritize these risks. And then you can say, okay, well, these are the things that I have to go after in terms of importance. But if I look at risk number 2 here, side reaction cell seals, that's not something I'm going to prove over the course of days or weeks. That might take years. So am I really willing to wait years, even though it's important to get to that risk inflection point? Maybe that's not where I should start. And so you can add a time dimension to this, and you can think about what you might call criticality, right? The combination of all of these things in a time normalized way. And you can decide, all right, well, if I want to show people that something that they might see as imaginary is actually real, what I can show them is this is the biggest risk and it's one that I can retire. And if I show you that I can retire it, not only have we gotten closer to the goal, but you're also going to have more confidence in me and my team that we can start to retire risks, and you'll be more likely to believe that I can retire the rest of these risks. So let's go after that one, and we're going to build our whole narrative around that value and risk inflection point. You hear me say narrative because that's always going to be important because perception matters. So that's the simple example. What I'd say is if you're not just developing a technology, it's hard enough if you're developing a technology in a lab. If you're now trying to think about viability across an entire business, it's much more complex. And this is back to that interrelated set of risks and coupling between the technology, the market, the team, and the finance. So what do? Are you really going to go? You could go across technology, market, team, and finance, and you could create a risk matrix. And then you can look at every permutation between technology and market, technology and team, and you could develop a risk matrix for each of those permutations, and you could create a big spreadsheet and add them up. I've never seen someone do it that comprehensively, but you could do it. And you could start to identify across all of this, what is the, what's the biggest risk? This is where I would say, I've used in the past this analogy of entrepreneurship as playing a chess game. This is where I'd say that you could do that, but you'd be trying to take an analytical approach to something which is a parallel brain process type of problem. So my personal bias is you're going to be limited in your ability to do that. And you also need to keep in mind all of these things are moving, right? 3 months ago, the risks of raising seed funding from venture capitalists was different than it is now in COVID. And so it can't be a static process. It needs to be a dynamic process. And so how do you think about this? Just so folks know what you're looking at here, I put this kind of eye chart up. This is something that we've developed over time, which is just meant to show that while there's no universal framework for how you move forward value across these areas, you can start to think about maturity levels, how mature your technology is versus your market. And you can start to think about like, what are the check boxes that show that you've hit a certain maturity in your thinking and development in that area. And what we've used this chart for in the past is to be able to have a conversation around, well, where are you and what are your known knowns and your unknown unknowns and your unknown knowns? And by the way, there's not just risk in each of these areas, there's risk across them. So for instance, if you tell me that you're at level 5, you've developed the technology enormously, but you actually haven't really spent time working with customers, there's a risk in the fact that you're so out of sync between those two in terms of your maturity, right? So some of this is about coordination between these. this is the last slide, and this is, I think, where hopefully it kind of comes together, which is in the face of this complexity of risks and thinking and value creation opportunities and thinking about prioritization. I believe that the only way you do this is through an iterative approach. So integrative means it can't just be, Steve Blank is incredible and customer discovery is incredible, but if all your conversations and your discovery hypotheses are about market and customers, you're missing 3/4 of the areas that might, make you toast in risk. So you need to be thinking about all of these things. And the basic process and what we've built at least Activate's program around through quarterly meetings and otherwise is, go through, prepare a presentation where you look at all these different areas and you say, what are our assumptions and our objectives? What's our hypothesis right now on all our assumptions? Get a sense of what are the biggest unknowns and risks across all of these things cohesively, and develop some hypotheses that over the next quarter you can go test to reduce risk in the most important areas. And there are 3 ways to do that. One is you go talk to people. Go talk to customers, go talk to venture capitalists. Oh, we thought that we'd be able to raise X money, but probably not. So we need to reset our algorithm. You could do internal analysis like the techno-economic analysis you'll hear from Beth, or you could go execute. Let's go actually get a piece of data in the lab to retire, ask, risk, prove a hypothesis, and then you could update based on your learnings and repeat. And one of the reasons this, you have this star here, which is part of the problem is, to be able to catch the unknown unknowns and the blind spots and identify what are the most important risks coupled across these areas. If you've never done this before, you probably shouldn't be super confident that you're going to be the best person to be able to look cohesively across those. So no matter who you are in whatever area you're working on, having people who have either expert in each of these areas or across them, they can poke and they can help you say, well, wait a second, I don't see it that way. I see this is your biggest existential risk or opportunity right now. And this is probably the most important piece. So let me now, that's great. I'm done with all the talking, and I'm so glad to have Stephen on the line, because what I'll do now is, Stephen, I'm going to ask you to give another just quick reaction. And as Stephen's doing that, what I'd love is for anyone who's got thoughts and questions that have come to mind through this, Brenna's going to put a Slack thread for folks to be able to share those. And we'll have a chance to at least touch on a few of those before we have to break. Steve, you there? I think you're muted.
I was there, but I was on mute. Yes.
Tell us about, you've now managed, you've managed Kinetics, both in managing technical teams, but also think about Mosaic, corporate environments, startup environments, pre-commercial environments. So what have been some of your kind of key framings or takeaways or advice, for someone who's like just at T=0?
Yeah, I think the sort of biggest thing I've learned in sort of evolution is, early days when I was, first I was in school and then at, a startup company that did a lot, whose business was around sort of contract research and very early stage materials discovery. I was always very focused on the actual technology, like what can we make this material do? How much can we do better than the state of the art? And what I've sort of learned over time is, while that's necessary, it's not sufficient, and it's not where at least most people tend to miss things. Where you tend to miss things is at the product level. Like what would you actually deliver to that end user who's going to spend money? And is that exciting? And so what I've learned to do is focus on that right from the beginning. And even if you've got a lot of unknowns of how your technology translates into the product, estimate that as best you can. Make sure you're comparing that to all the alternatives, and that it's still compelling. So to give a good example of this, there was a battery I'm going to have to be a little vague on the specifics, but there was a battery technology that we were looking at, and it was a new cell chemistry. And if you compared it to the alternatives in the market, it looked really, really good. There was work to do, a lot of invention that had to happen, but if it succeeded, you could build a battery for certain markets was radically better than what was there today. The problem came up when we actually started looking at this at the product level. And while you could certainly, again, it was better than the alternative batteries on the market, at the product level, when you were looking at battery packs, you could, there were things you could do at the pack level to modify the existing designs that would allow them to serve the same function as this other battery type. And while it wouldn't be quite as good, having a single battery at the system level was so vastly cheaper. And especially if you played tricks on trading off the energy between the two batteries using intelligent algorithms, that you basically could just obsolete all the batteries on the market, including the one you could develop. And so the fact that there was a chemistry solution to the problem that was out in the market, that was nice, but that was years of development. There was a different engineering solution, much, much simpler, that could just obsolete the whole category. And so we ended up going with that. But if we had focused on that narrowly from a material scientist's perspective or someone developing a new technology, it looked great when you compared it to all the other materials, but there was a different systems level solution. And so making sure you're always carrying things up to the systems level, and then if you're not a systems person, getting feedback from the people who are and who would be that end customer is really critical, or you could end up basically inventing things that have no market. And so,
that's Steve.
Yeah. And so nowadays, in my group, when we're evaluating technologies and when we're presenting our progress out to the wider organization, we always present those systems level, the systems level performance. And then with often some heavy notes about like, okay, there's this model underlying this and there's, these guesses involved, but, best we can do at the moment.
That's great.
Thanks for sharing the case study as well. Brenna, how are we doing on questions?
Yeah, we have a couple that have come in. So Grayson, are you open to unmute and share your question with the group?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I think something that I've been wondering is, what are the cheap ways that you recommend validating or de-risking markets kind of before the technology's commercialized? You mentioned spec sheets, letters of intent, like ways you can really kind of get to that inflection point on the market in a short time frame before you have a complete product that you can sell into.
So Steve, I'll tee that up to you. And I also, we've got Amy and Tom on the line that have a lot of experience as well. So would welcome Amy or Tom, either you jumping in as well.
Yeah, so what we did with Mosaic, and we definitely had this challenge where, the end market was a giant gas separation plant that costs hundreds of millions to $1 billion to build. But what we found was basically we could build a techno-economic model, essentially, literally a paper study of what that plant would look like. And we would have a certain level of confidence in this, but we could share that model with customers who, had experience in this space, and they could poke holes in the model and say, well, actually, we think that assumption should be this. We think this should be over here, et cetera. And we could refine that model over time until it was convincing to the end customer. And, that then had to obviously be followed up with providing them samples, let them do their own testing. But we could get when we got to the point where we could present that model and they would nod and say, yeah, okay, I believe those assumptions, that gave us a lot more confidence. And then in my job now, what we will typically do is design what we call proof of concept, basically identify what we think are the critical technical risks. We use the same risk model that Elon was talking about, mostly again inspired by Vinod. But identify what do we think is the hardest technical problems, and what is the simplest way we can measure whether that problem is solved or not. Very much geared on what's the cheapest, fastest way to get to that proof.
Tom or Amy, any commentary? And I think part of the question is like beyond validating, beyond reducing risk for a particular product or technology. It sounds like you're also, Grayson, interested in like, how do you de-risk the market as a whole? Is that right?
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
I mean, technology, it's hard to do, but it's easy to write the roadmap and have quantitative validation. But you know, how do you convince? I guess we have more market risk maybe than technical risk. So I'm always interested in how to de-risk that side and present it, you know, to investors or to your own team on how to do that.
Grayson, I'd jump in just kind of knowing a little bit about what you're doing. I think it's all of the above in your case. I think that you need a spec sheet, right, which says, I have this performance along these parameters. You need a techno-economic model in that you need to know how much your widget's going to cost versus the state of the art. And then to Stephen's point, I think the value add is at the systems level for you. So, you know, you have to understand if they install my widget in their system at a system level, where's the value being created? Who's capturing it? How much is it versus the alternatives, et cetera. So I think it's a lot of upfront kind of Excel spreadsheeting to convince yourself that there is a path, and then it's going out and validating that by, you know, essentially, I have this thesis that this value can be created in your marketplace. Can you tell me if that's true or not, right? Like, and then iterate on what you receive in the what feedback. I like to do the modeling first and convince myself with, at least from my framework, whether there's value, and then go validate it in the market. Other people prefer the other way around, so it's sort of a, you know, it's up to you, I think, and how you like to operate. I don't know, Amy, you've got a lot of experience doing this as well.
Well, as we transition over to Amy, you know, I'm realizing the next question that I'm seeing here from Matt is, what are some of the key phrases, reactions that could indicate an industry partner would be moving from just intrigued to the step of becoming involved? And so this is kind of connected, right? Like, how do you de-risk the market? But Amy, since you've got so much experience working with industry, and then we'll kick it back to Steve, who has been playing this role in industry, wondering if you have thoughts on that one as well.
Yeah, it'd be great to get Steve's perspective as well. But I think one thing is not to be super convinced that it will be a fast process. I think it's more about multiple conversations with a variety of stakeholders. And the way you can kind of measure traction is who's going to talk to you a second time and a third time and a fourth time. And as Steve mentioned earlier, the important part is kind of when people are actually willing to commit time and resources to actually developing and testing what it is that you're working on. So, you know, in the context of a few conversations, if you can get to the point where someone's willing to invest some of their resources to actually be able to help move your technology forward, that's kind of the end goal that you're trying to get to. But you will have a lot of initial conversations, and then a subset of those folks are going to want to talk to you again. And if you look across the breadth of sort of either application space, system level things that they're system level products that they're representing, you can start to then kind of hone in on what that initial beachhead or target market will be. So if you have 5 areas that you're going to want to go in, and this group of people keep talking to you and giving you more information and more data to help you refine your thinking, that's already kind of at least the early stages of what you might consider market traction.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. And I guess to put a little emphasis on some points, like part of my group's job is to evaluate new technologies. That's literally part of our mandate. And as a result, we will take a meeting with literally anybody in our field. Like it takes virtually nothing to get us to agree to talk. Where there's a large barrier is to get us to agree to put time into it. And so, you know, if whoever you're talking to is willing to, you know, run a whole bunch of tests, do a whole bunch of modeling for you, especially if they're asking you and paying for samples, that's an indication of interest that you know, that can't be, it can't be misinterpreted. The other thing to gauge like how intense that interest is, if you're talking to someone and they're doing something small that they can sign off on their own, then they're curious. If they're want to do something with you that requires them to go to their boss or their skip level boss to get approval, then they're really serious because they're willing to basically not put their reputation on the line, but take a risk for you, which means they actually believe that that working with you is going to create value for them, and meaning they really care. And that's very much on my end. Getting samples, doing a test, I can just do that. I'm not going to do it for the heck of it, but not a big risk on my part. If I'm going to fund a project with somebody to actually optimize a material, scale a material, things like that, I'm going to my VP to get approval, which I'm not going to do unless I'm reasonably confident. I'm confident it's worth it. So
Thanks,
that's sort of I think ways you gauge whether someone's serious or not.
I'll make just one last comment on this, and then I'm looking at time, so I think we'll wrap it up. But the only thing I want to not lose sight of is there are the analytical frameworks, and as technologists, we're trying to look for where's the data. If Grayson, you're in the mode where you're talking about really creating a new market or envisioning a market because the world's going to change, then the reactive approach to validating that market may come up short. And, we can't lose sight of the fact that for some of the biggest, most important transformations that we've had with science, it's someone who says, just wait, the world's going to look different and change, and this market is big. And that's where the perception comes into play, where if that's the case, you want to think about, well, what are the indicators that help me realize that I'm not completely off my rocker? And maybe you can test against those indicators. But a piece of this too is there's a role to say, there's a role to drive the perception. Steven's saying that he needs to drop. So, hey, Steve, thank you so much for taking this time. And Brenna, I think we're probably wrapping up, right?
Yes, we are.
No problem. And I was just saying, if people had more questions or wanted to talk offline, happy to do that as well.
Fabulous. Thank you, everybody.
Right.
Same time, same
Good
place.
week, everyone.